This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. In recent years, Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico and former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan survived being shot. Former Argentine Vice President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner narrowly escaped a shooting attempt, and assassinations claimed the lives of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and British politicians Joe Cox and David Amis. Is this string of political violence new? And will things ever go back to normal? And what is normal? A few years ago now, I was walking past a restaurant in Northern Virginia on a one-block commercial strip in a small near-in suburb of Washington, D.C. 3 enormous black SUVs with blacked-out windows pulled up, filling an entire intersection and causing the kind of hullabaloo you didn't normally see there. Naturally, I stopped. I watched as men in dark suits and sunglasses, with earpieces in their ears, scrambled around the vehicles and stood at the restaurant door. Who was it getting this kind of attention? Eventually, the back door of the SUV swung open, and out stepped Mike Johans, the Secretary of Agriculture of the United States of America and a former governor of Nebraska. Sure, it was post 9/11, when heightened security had percolated into every public encounter of senior government officials. But I also wondered, who wanted to hurt the Secretary of Agriculture? Was it now the order of the day that men and women with big jobs had to assume someone could try to kill them? Just how big a feature of our 21st century life is the assumption of an undertow of political violence? Bruce Hoffman is the author of God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a professor at Georgetown University. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we've had a couple of assassination attempts on President Donald Trump. One where an assailant opened fire, one that was foiled. How would you characterize the most recent, the foiled attack? Radical right-wing or something else?
We don't really know. It doesn't seem like radical right-wing. It seems the most common denominator of assassins or would-be assassins nowadays are disgruntlement. Someone who is just angry, pissed off, alienated, feels disenfranchised, is usually intimately involved somehow with social media and decides to take matters into their own hands. And the attempt on former President Trump's life in Butler, Pennsylvania, in July is a case in point. The shooter stalked both President Biden and former President Trump. I mean, he seemed ecumenical in who he wanted to take out.
You know, one day I was walking in Rome, where I had worked part of my career as a reporter, and I was near the Chamber of Deputies. A cab rolled up, and out stepped the Italian Prime Minister, Giovanni Spadolini. And I said hello to him, I shook his hand, and I said to my wife as we were walking away, it's kind of unbelievable. And as I think back to that now, it's almost unimaginable to think that someone of that prominence could travel with a tiny detail. I think he was with 1 or 2 people, and one of them was a security guy, and one was just like a coat holder, a body man. If you decide to be in public life, you now have to accept that you have to go behind the veil at that level, because you're a target, and you may never live an exactly normal life again.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And the problem is you're a target not only because of your political positions or because of whatever political enemies you might have made, but you're also a target because of your prominence that then gives the individual assassin their 15 minutes or tweeted nanoseconds of fame. And that, I think, has become the problem. I mean, as you described Prime Minister Spadolini, I mean, don't forget in the 1980s, the Swedish Prime Minister, Olof Palme, was going to the movies with his wife and was killed, and that's never really been solved. So there's a tendency, of course, at times when there is not this polarization and divisiveness in society, that elected political leaders can relax. Then a tragedy intervenes that ratchets back up the security. And I think we're certainly in that era now, both in the United States and Europe, certainly in Japan. One is to say, even in Russia, because of course in 2022, there was an attempt on the life of the Russian ultranationalist and philosopher and very close Putin confidant, Alexander Dugin, that killed his daughter. So even in a police state, assassinations are attempted. So it's not just a disease or a plague of liberal Western democracies and open societies.
Professor, is there a momentum, a direction of movement? Is this something that's sourced in the United States and pushing out to the rest of the world? Or is this something that's just part of a rising tide everywhere?
Both. I mean, on the one hand, it's not just the United States that's characterized by alienation, by polarization, by political divisiveness. I mean, there are many other countries. But that said, there are certain streams of or patterns of activity that have been replicated overseas. For instance, violent far-right extremism in the United States, especially over the immigrant issue, has been exported to Ireland and to the United Kingdom, for example, where rioters and protesters in those countries and those who advocate for even more extreme measures have cited treatises, statements, events in the United States as an inspiration. So the United States is the leader of the free world. The United States is looked up to by countries throughout the world as an exemplar of democracy and moral values. But there also is this darker side where some of the certainly more violent and malignant currents in our political system are seized upon as an example or an exemplar even, or a model by persons elsewhere. And to give you a very specific example, someone like Brenton Tarrant, who carried out the attack in 2018 in Christchurch, New Zealand against two mosques, basically cited his act as emulating mass shooters in the United States and hoping to inspire even more. So there's this circularity now that we see between acts of violence occurring overseas that either are inspired by incidents in the United States or are designed in turn to inspire even more violence in the United States.
Is part of the problem, part of the challenge, that the number of possible sources of incoming fire just keep increasing, that you don't know who's going to come for you and for what reason. So if you want to craft a defense, craft a response, you have to be looking at everything all the time. That there are just now so many more angry people in so many more places who are willing to do so much more that it's hard to keep up with.
Yes, I think the authorities are clearly overwhelmed. And I think we've seen this in the case of the United States Secret Service, that in recent years has been stretched by exactly what you described, this widening pool of high-level individuals that they have to provide security for, from those secretaries of agriculture who arguably in years past were not as high-valued targets as the Secretary of State or indeed the president, but who, firstly, because of the extraordinary security that has now attended any senior members of cabinet, assassins will just go to what they feel is the next most accessible target. So that pool is broadened. It's broadened to former presidents. I mean, we're in an era when we have many former presidents living. Former President Carter, for instance, is 100 years old or soon will be. That increases the pressure. Then there's the families of former presidents. So it's radiated outwards and put pressure on agencies not only to provide manpower, but to attempt to keep up with just the volume of chatter on social media and on both closed and open forums that may be suggestive of plots and plans, but the vast majority of which never materialize. But of course, it's that small percent that actually are not just motivated, but subsequently animated to carry out some act of violence and do so against what they regard as a prominent figure, because that gives their act of violence the publicity and the attention that the perpetrator desires.
Does that next available target syndrome you just described possibly explain why Mike Johans, who was hardly a fire-breathing politician during his career, I probably could have found 3 in 100 Americans who even had any idea who he was, why he would be protected the way a head of state might have been at another time in history?
That's exactly right. And no federal agency charged with the protection of high-level political appointees or elected officials wants to wake up the next morning and say, we should have given them protection as well. It's now become better to be safe and better to make sure that this person is well protected, not just for this person's physical safety, but I think very importantly is a deterrent message that if you have these ideas of trying to assassinate prominent individuals, they are now well protected, and it's going to be very difficult. That's intended to hopefully scare off anyone who might contemplate an attempt even on an official that's not as well known or prominent as some other members of the cabinet.
As motivation multiplies, in the United States certainly, so does means. There are now more guns than people, and there have been for some time. Does this make everything harder? You've got one of our major national political parties, certainly locally and state by state ways, encouraging as many people as can get their hands on them to own personal firearms. Is it just something that makes it harder to keep track of all the people you got to worry about?
Absolutely. And this isn't an editorial against the Second Amendment or any...
Oh, not at all. Not at all. I'm just thinking of it in practical terms.
No, yes, and exactly. It's just to state the facts. In 2020, 17 million firearms, a record number, were sold in the United States. There are 123 firearms per 100 persons in the United States. That is more than the next 5 countries of the world combined. And in fact, number 2 is Yemen, a country that I think everyone agree is enormously violent and unstable, that in fact doesn't have a cohesive single government. And there, it's less than half as much as the United States. It's 53 firearms per 100 persons. So certainly the availability of firearms in the United States, and including assault weapons, is a factor. And we actually see that in polling. For instance, 44% of persons who own assault weapons in a recent poll agreed with the statement that violence may be needed to set the federal government back on track. That jumped up to about 56% when those polled were people who had concealed weapons permits. So certainly the ease and availability of firearms is an enormous factor. But we've seen also attacks on politicians, some that have been tragically successful with knives or with homemade weapons. I mean, a homemade shotgun. Japan has the strictest firearms regulations almost in the world. But nonetheless, someone was able to fabricate a crude but ultimately very effective firearm that killed Shinzo Abe.
I wonder about the cultural context. When violence is more casually referred to as a possible solution to problems, I wonder if you're just creating a more welcoming Petri dish for that small subset of people who are willing to do something murderous, willing to do something that injures large numbers of people. I was at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Among the thousands and thousands of people I saw that day, only a subset were actually going to the Capitol with the intent of doing what they ended up doing. But there was a sort of wave that carried people along. And if you show up in tactical gear to something that's just supposed to be a rally where you cheer a guy you like and then get back in your truck and go home, that's different from just showing up in a Trump sweatshirt. There's something symbolic, but also something practical about wearing tactical gear on your arms, on your chest, a helmet instead of a red hat.
In the context of January 6th, though we know there are people that came prepared for violence and even for greater violence than we witnessed, because, of course, there are weapons caches in motels in Northern Virginia, for instance, that rapid reaction squads from some of the people who were convicted of seditious conspiracy were planning to implement. And I think that's the problem, is that with social media, you have this phenomena that even if you're not thinking seriously about violence, you're in a milieu where violence has become the lingua franca. And without doing one another, being more extreme is kind of a badge of honor, being like really clever and really snarky and really hateful or really aggressive becomes something that's applauded with likes or expressions of support. And that it means that this small minority that might have been inclined to violence, that pool is constantly expanding because they're being encouraged. They're being egged on in some cases. But I think the worst thing is that there are online voices that provide a legitimization that they may never have heard or never gotten before. And therefore, this small number feels emboldened to do so. And the problem is they have the means at their disposal, which is access, for instance, to firearms or other weaponry.
In your article called The Accelerating Threat of the Political Assassination, you bring up something that I think our listeners should know about that's relevant in the aftermath of the Trump assassination attempts. And that's the awkwardness facing opposing politicians when faced with condemning hatred and violence and seeming to renege on their own political positions. Is it impossible for us to put public safety above and beyond politics, to create a space to talk about this stuff that isn't necessarily conditioned by your profile as a politician?
It's very difficult, and that's because I think this kind of rhetoric and then these acts of violence are designed to really tear at a country's social fabric, is designed to deepen these divisions. It's designed to limit the space of politicians to respond, really. And it's a naked attempt at countering our democracy and smothering it with either violence or the threat of violence. Exactly as you described, it creates a lot of difficulties for political figures who don't want to alienate a base that, for instance, is a part of the appeal is their anger and their frustration and their sense of disenfranchisement. And knowing how to strike a balance between playing to that sense of being an outsider or being a loser, but not encouraging violence. And I don't think we've come close to finding that balance.
Are you concerned by the rise, or what seems to me to be the rise? I haven't got stats at my fingertips, of taking these conflicts, taking these political debates to the homes of public officials. Have we crossed a line there that really needs to be watched?
Absolutely. I mean, this is something where I think any semblance of civility and of discourse has just vanished, where you can not only pursue someone to their home and not only confront them, but harass their family and indeed threaten violence. Don't forget the individual that was arrested outside Associate Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh's house was arrested outside of a suburban Maryland house. He decided he had traveled from California with the intention to assassinate Justice Kavanaugh. At the last minute, changed his mind and turned himself in. I mean, tragedy was averted. But this is a very serious issue. And frankly, it's something that Congress and the executive have not come to grips with, because you can go online and for as little as $1.99, find all the personal details of almost anyone, their home address, their social security number, their cell phone number, and then you can stalk them.
And it seems that there's a real clash of values here. As uncivil and as potentially threatening as they can be, the ideal when we talk about public service is that public servants are, in fact, citizens, members of the public, not covered up by 16 layers of protection and inability to be penetrated by normal rank and file members of the society. We think, yes, this person works for me, I should be able to talk to them. But that ideal has to stand quite uncomfortably next to the fact that people are ready or readier than they've been to be violent, to be threatening, that nobody who runs for Congress or the United States Senate should have to worry about being constantly threatened.
We have never had the debate or discussion that is absolutely essential between what are constitutionally protected First Amendment rights, rights of expression, but also rights of protest and assembly, and rights of personal and public safety in the digital era. This has changed enormously from when the Constitution was first enacted and then for the next, 225, 235 years. But in the digital era, one's information is much more available, and therefore the targets of someone's animus or hatred are far more accessible. And the line, I think, is shifting. And this is an important debate that, for instance, the United Kingdom has had. Exactly a year ago, actually, they passed the Online Safety Act, which lays out the responsibilities of government to its citizens online in terms of not just political extremism and terrorism, but harassment, shaming, bullying, certainly human trafficking, sextortion. I mean, lots of issues that we have avoided because of the First Amendment, really, in tackling in this country, that there has to be a very clear line that's crossed, not just threatening violence, but the imminent commission of violence, which is often very hard to determine.
You feel a little bit of loss, frankly. I mean, obviously, with a press card in your pocket or hanging around your neck, you're a little different, but it's now tough to move around in a way that it used to be almost celebratory. You could walk in the Capitol building without being asked every 20 feet whether you belong there or having your credentials checked. Something really big happened, and it's a tremendous loss.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, think of one of the iconic political photographs of the 1940 presidential candidate, Wendell Willkie, campaigning, and he's in an open-topped car. He's standing there in a white suit, and you can see in this photograph, he's on a parade route, and people are right next to the car, and they're reaching out to him, and he's reaching out to them. And you have a situation now where everything has to be absolutely orchestrated, as you described. But I think what's worse, and what we often fail to remember, is that generally speaking, and I know a few exceptions, once security measures are put in place, they're very rarely, if ever, removed. So in other words, we are constantly adding layer upon layer of security. We're never going to go back to the old days. And you have to ask the question, really, where does it stop? Exactly as you described. How far does this remove our elected officials from contact with their constituents? And in the United Kingdom, the representative for Finchley, which is what Margaret Thatcher, the former prime minister, the area in London and North London she used to represent, it's a predominantly Jewish area. He concluded that he couldn't run for office again because he couldn't put his staff, his legislative assistants, at the risk they constantly face. Even if he's not there, just going into that local office in his constituency was so dangerous for them. And he didn't have an answer, and he didn't want to be surrounded by these endless layers of security. So he just decided he just wasn't going to run for office again.
Well, you describe this as a one-way trend. Is there any light on the horizon? Are there any reasons to believe that societies are getting a handle on this, trying to find an equilibrium, a dwell point that works both for the public and public servants, that we may be at least in sight of a high watermark?
None of this occurs in a vacuum. When our country and other countries return to civil discourse, when the vituperation that has become a part of politics now, when the overheated rhetoric that is now commonplace, where the snarky tweets or snappy one-liners fade and we have serious discussions, then it will happen. As someone who studies political violence, what I would say is it's going to take, as historically has almost always been the case, some terrible tragedy, some unspeakable tragedy, whether it's a major attack or the actual successful assassination of a leading political figure that hopefully will bring us to our senses and sort of dial back not just the rhetoric and understand that words matter, but also, if it dials back the rhetoric, may enable us to return to a more balanced, I would argue, and a more sensible security profile for these elected officials.
That's Bruce Hoffman of Georgetown University. He's the author of God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.